The airport lounge at Heathrow smelled like cigarette smoke and coffee that had been sitting in its pot long enough to become something closer to an argument than a beverage. It was February 1969, and the terminal had that specific quality of suspended time that airports develop when weather delays stack up and the announced departures stop being announcements and start being suggestions. Outside, the London fog was doing what London fog did in February, which was to make the concept of visibility feel like an optimistic rumor. Flights to Amsterdam had been pushed back 2 hours. Flights to New York were being evaluated. The board of departures clicked and shuffled with the indifferent patience of a system that had never been designed to make anyone feel better about waiting. The bar adjacent to Gate 7 had 40 people in it that afternoon who had not planned to be there. Some of them were businessmen with loosened ties, and the particular frantic energy of men accustomed to controlling their schedules, suddenly confronted with a schedule that had decided not to be controlled. Some were tourists in that state of mild distress that comes from missing a connection and not speaking enough of the local language to understand exactly how bad the situation is. And some were musicians, because February 1969 was a moment when every airport in Europe had musicians moving through it in both directions, the scene so fluid and interconnected that the industry joked you could identify its pulse by counting the guitar cases at any gate. Jimi Hendrix was sitting at the far end of the bar with a glass of orange juice and a copy of a science fiction novel that he'd been reading the same page of for the past 20 minutes. He was wearing a purple shirt with ruffles at the cuffs that should have looked absurd on anyone and somehow looked inevitable on him, and a wide-brimmed hat that was tilted at an angle suggesting he'd put it on without looking at a mirror, and it had found its correct position anyway. His hair was the way his hair always was, magnificent in its refusal to behave according to any known system of gravity or social expectation. He looked like a man who was comfortable being still, which was unusual for someone whose performing life was defined by motion. But Hendrix was always full of contradictions that resolved themselves into coherence the moment you watched him long enough. He had not been recognized by most of the bar's occupants. This was more common than people assumed. Off stage, without the guitar and the lights and the architecture of performance surrounding him, Hendrix moved through public spaces with a quietness that his fame had not entirely stripped from him. He looked at the page of his book and thought about something that had nothing to do with the book, and drank his orange juice slowly, and waited for the fog to make a decision. The man who sat 2 stools down from him at the bar was named Gordon Ashford. He was 46 years old, British by birth, and had spent the previous 22 years building the kind of career in the music industry that commanded enormous respect from people who knew what they were looking at, and almost no recognition from people who didn't. He was a session guitarist, one of the finest in London, a man whose hands had laid down parts on recordings that had sold tens of millions of copies, and whose name appeared nowhere on the sleeve of any of them. He had played on television scores, on orchestral arrangements, on folk albums and pop singles and scores for films nobody had seen and films everybody had seen. He read music the way other people read newspapers. His technique was immaculate in the classical sense, which meant it was built on a foundation of absolute discipline and structural precision, and a deeply held philosophical belief that music was a language with rules, and that the rules were not arbitrary constrictions, but load-bearing walls without which the language collapsed into noise. He was having whiskey and a conversation with 2 younger musicians he'd been sitting with when the delay was announced. They were in their mid-20s, aspiring to session work themselves, and they had the particular combination of talent and ambition and uncertainty that produces people who ask a lot of questions of anyone older who seems willing to answer them. The conversation had moved the way bar conversations at airports move, from the immediate complaint of the delay to professional discussions, to the broader question of what was happening in music in early 1969, which was a question with a lot of available answers and no shortage of opinions. It was in this context that Gordon Ashford said what he said. He said it not as an attack, not as provocation. He said it with the considered certainty of a craftsman who has spent decades thinking about his craft and has arrived at conclusions that seem to him as self-evident as the results of any other sustained analysis. He said that the psychedelic rock movement, specifically the strand of it that had dominated the past 3 years, was fundamentally a dead end, a spectacle masquerading as music. He said that what passed for innovation in that genre was in most cases the substitution of technical incompetence with volume, and the replacement of musical knowledge with chemical supplementation in the compositional process. It sounded interesting to people who didn't know enough about music to identify what was missing, which was structure, which was theory, which was the kind of rigorous formal understanding of what sound actually was and how it actually worked that transformed noise into meaning. The guitar playing that the movement had elevated to iconic status, he continued, was impressive in the same way that a fire was impressive, visually arresting, emotionally stimulating, and ultimately destructive rather than constructive. Psychedelic rock, he concluded, was not a musical direction, it was a fashion, and fashions by definition served no lasting purpose. He said all of this with conviction and without cruelty, which was in some ways worse than if he'd said it with either of the other two things. The younger musicians nodded at some points and looked uncertain at others, the way people do when someone who clearly knows more than them says something that doesn't feel quite right, but that they can't articulate the counter-argument to. Hendrix had heard it. He'd been 2 stools away, and the bar was not large, and Ashford had not been whispering. He'd kept reading his page, or pretending to. He set the book down on the bar with the deliberate care of someone organizing his thoughts alongside his possessions. He picked up his orange juice and finished it. He looked at the departure board, which hadn't changed. Then he turned slightly on his stool and looked at the back of Gordon Ashford's head, and then at the guitar case leaning against the bar next to Ashford's stool. "Is that yours?" he asked. His voice was quiet, not especially distinctive in isolation, a slight American softness to it, the trace of Seattle underneath the years in London. Ashford turned, and at this range you could see the moment of recognition moving across his face, a slow wave of realization that took maybe 3 seconds from start to complete arrival. Ashford said, "Yes, that's mine." "What action?" Hendrix asked. He meant the string height, the distance between the strings and the fretboard. It was a specific technical question, the kind that one guitarist asks another when they want to understand how an instrument is set up, and you could see it recalibrate Ashford's assumption slightly, the way specific technical knowledge from an unexpected source always does. "Low action," Ashford said. "Classical setup." Hendrix nodded at the case. "Mind if I look at it?" There was a pause, not a long one. Ashford was a professional, and professionals understood the weight of that particular request in that particular context, and he said no, be my guest, and lifted the case to the bar and opened it. The guitar inside was a 1957 Martin D28, acoustic, steel strings, the kind of instrument that takes 40 years to reach its full voice because the wood needs that long to open up completely. It was immaculate. The kind of care that had gone into maintaining it was visible in every detail. The polish of the frets, the condition of the nut, the way the tuning peg sat with the attention of objects that are frequently serviced. This was not a guitar that was occasionally played. This was a guitar that was lived with. Hendrix looked at it in the case for a moment without touching it. His eyes moved the way they moved when he was reading something, taking inventory before engaging. Then he looked up at Ashford. "May I?" Ashford said yes. Hendrix lifted the Martin out of its case with hands that were instantly transformed by the act of holding an instrument. The change was not dramatic. It was not a performance. It was the almost invisible shift in presence that happens when a person makes contact with the specific object that their nervous system has been organized around for most of their life. His left hand went to the neck and his right hand came to the body of the guitar, and he held it for a moment in playing position, not playing yet, just settling. Then he played 7 seconds of music. What happened in those 7 seconds is the part that everyone who was in that bar, in that lounge at Heathrow in February 1969, and who has since spoken about it, struggles to describe, because describing music accurately is genuinely one of the hardest things language has ever been asked to do, and what Hendrix played in those 7 seconds would have been difficult to describe, even if the person describing it had extensive formal musical training and unlimited time to try. He played an acoustic run. That is the technical description. It was a single passage of notes on an acoustic steel string guitar, no amplification, no effects, no supporting instruments, just wood and wire and air and the hands that connected them. It lasted approximately 7 seconds. It incorporated elements of blues pentatonic structure and extended jazz harmony, and something that had no category in any of the formal systems Ashford had spent his career inside, something that seemed to use the physics of the instrument against itself, bending the pitch in places where steel strings on an acoustic guitar were not generally considered to bend in the way that Hendrix bent them, creating overtones that the room seemed to receive rather than the guitar to produce. 7 seconds. The two younger musicians looked at each other with the expression of people who have just seen a magic trick performed so smoothly, they're not sure where the trick ended and the reality began. Several people at nearby tables stopped their conversations in the middle of words. A woman who had been walking toward the bar stopped walking without appearing to decide to do so. Ashford sat very still. Hendrix handed the Martin back to him with both hands, with the same care he'd used to lift it out. He picked his book up off the bar. Then he looked at Ashford with eyes that were without malice, without any architecture of superiority, just the particular directness of someone who has said something and is waiting to see if it was understood. Ashford held his guitar and looked at it, and then looked at Hendrix, and then looked at the guitar again. When he spoke, his voice had changed in the way that voices sometimes do after something has shifted the assumptions underlying them. "Where did you learn that?" he said. Hendrix considered the question. Not the way you consider a question you don't know the answer to. The way you consider a question whose answer is complicated and that you want to give enough room to be accurate. "I learned some of it from records," he said. "Muddy Waters, Robert Johnson. Before that, people nobody recorded who played on porches in the South. I learned some of it from my own hands, from sitting with the guitar until it stopped feeling like an instrument and started feeling like a way to talk." He paused. "And some of it I haven't learned yet. That's the part I'm working on." Ashford was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What you just did was not psychedelic. That was structure. That was theory. That was formal knowledge executed at a level that took me a full minute to even begin to decode." "Not all of what we do sounds like that," Hendrix agreed. "Not everything I play in a show sounds like that, because a show is a conversation with 10,000 people at the same time, and you have to use a language that 10,000 people can participate in simultaneously. You use volume and repetition and the frequencies that the body responds to before the mind has time to evaluate. You go to the nervous system directly. That's not ignorance. That's a different kind of precision." Ashford turned the Martin over in his hands absently. The way you turn something over when your hands want something to do while your mind is somewhere else. "You're saying the distortion, the feedback," he said. "That's intentional in a technical sense, not just theatrical." "Every frequency is intentional," Hendrix said. "Feedback has pitch. Distortion creates harmonic content that the clean signal doesn't have. When you sustain a note into feedback, you're not losing control of the instrument. You're extending into a range the instrument can't reach cleanly. The question is always whether you know where you're going, whether you can hear the specific pitch in the feedback and take it somewhere, or whether you're just making noise and calling it expression." The two younger musicians had gone completely quiet. They were watching the way students watch when something they've been trying to understand is suddenly being explained in a language that works. Ashford said, "I have spent 40 years believing that the formal structures were the container that gave music its meaning, that outside the container there was only chaos." Hendrix looked at the departure board. Still no changes. Outside, the fog continued its negotiation with the future. "The container is real," Hendrix said. "The container holds the water, but water doesn't have to stay in one container to be water. It takes the shape of whatever holds it." He reached forward and turned the Martin over gently and pointed to the back of the instrument where the grain of the wood was visible through the finish in long parallel lines that curved slightly at the edges where the sides had been bent into shape. "All of this was a tree," he said. "The tree didn't know it was going to be an instrument. The instrument doesn't know what notes it's going to play. The structure doesn't determine the music. The structure makes the music possible." He let go of the guitar. "I wasn't trying to prove anything with what I just played," he said. "I only wanted you to know that we're not working without knowledge. We made a choice about which knowledge to use and which rules to break with our eyes open. There's a difference between someone who breaks a rule because they don't know it exists and someone who breaks it because they understand exactly what it costs and they've decided the thing they can make with the break is worth more than the thing they can make with the rule." Ashford held the guitar across his lap and sat with that for a long, quiet moment. Then he said, "Who taught you theory?" "Nobody taught me the name for what I was doing," Hendrix said. "I learned it by doing it. I can't read notation the way you can, but I can hear what you're hearing when you read it. I'm working in the same language from a different entry point." Ashford looked at him. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The bar noise continued around them, the impatient conversations of delayed travelers, the coffee machine that needed servicing, the departure board clicking to another inconclusive update. "Would you like to hear the instrument?" Ashford asked. "What it sounds like when I play it?" Hendrix said yes, actually I would. Ashford held the Martin and played. He played something in the classical finger-picking tradition, precise and articulate and beautiful in the way that things built with absolute discipline. Over decades are beautiful, each note placed with the confidence of a man who has practiced that placement hundreds of thousands of times and who knows exactly where the note will be when his finger arrives at the string. It was masterful, It was the guitar as an argument for structure, for rigor, for the idea that constraint produces depth rather than preventing it. Hendrix listened with his whole body, with that quality of attention he had that was visible to anyone watching him, the quality of someone for whom listening was an active physical process and not a passive waiting for the other person to stop producing sound. When Ashford finished, Hendrix nodded slowly. Then he said, "You play the guitar like you're reading a sentence you already know by heart, every word in the right place. That's what I've spent 40 years achieving," Ashford said. "That's extraordinary," Hendrix said, and he meant it completely. "I play the guitar like I'm trying to say something I don't have the words for yet. Every performance is the attempt. Some nights I get closer than others." Ashford looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his whiskey and finished it. He said something then that wasn't an admission exactly, and wasn't an apology, but was something between the two that doesn't have a clean name in English. He said that what he'd said earlier, about psychedelic rock, had been accurate about some of it, and wrong about the rest of it, and that the error wasn't in the observation, but in the application of the observation to things he hadn't looked at closely enough. Hendrix said he appreciated that, and you could hear that he did. The departure board clicked. Amsterdam was clearing. New York was still under evaluation. The bar began the slow reorganization of a space that is about to lose most of its occupants to gates and jetways, and the resumption of schedules. Ashford closed the Martin back into its case with the care of someone returning something important to its home. Before he stood up, he asked Hendrix one more question. He asked him what the 7-second run was, what it was from, whether it was something he composed or something he found. Hendrix thought about it. "I was going to use it in a song I'm working on," he said. "I haven't found where it fits yet. Sometimes things exist before the place they belong exists. You carry them until the place appears." Ashford nodded. He picked up the guitar case and stood and straightened his coat, the precise automatic movements of a man preparing to return to the world of schedules. He looked at Hendrix one final time, and the look had layers in it that were different from any look he'd given him since the conversation began. He said, "I hope you find where it fits." Hendrix picked up his book. "I usually do," he said. They went to their separate gates. Outside, the fog made its decision, and the board began to update in earnest, and the lounge emptied the way all temporary gatherings eventually empty, the particular people returning to their particular trajectories, carrying what they'd encountered back into the streams of their lives. Gordon Ashford gave an interview 12 years later, in 1981, where he was asked to name the most significant conversation of his musical life. He named one that had taken place in an airport lounge during a fog delay in February 1969. He did not describe what had been said in any detail. He said only that he had gone into that conversation certain about something and had come out of it holding a much more interesting question in the place where the certainty had been. He said that questions were more useful than certainties in music. And in most other things, he added. In most other things as well.